Today, before I introduce my good personal friend Gary, I want to give you a little background so that you begin to understand what he's actually accomplished in his life, how he has transformed himself. And so, to give you just a tiny bit of background, Gary has a genetic disorder that means the consequences are over the course of his life, he's broken over 100 bones, had numerous surgeries, and now it stands a towering 4 foot 2 inches tall and navigates life by a wheelchair. But despite outrageous challenges, things that would crush so many, Gary also has been a champion wheelchair athlete, successful business owner, and now he inspires multitudes with a message of believing for God's best in spite of his own personal challenges. So today I want to introduce you to my friend Gary, and you can find his website. We'll say it again later, but it's unbreakablehope.com. And with that, Gary, tell us, set the stage by talking about the challenges you started out with life.
Well, first of all, Randy, it is awesome to be with you. You're a dear friend and an encourager, and I'm honored to be with you and having a chat. We normally have many chats, but this one is actually being videoed. So
Yeah.
we got to be careful what we say, I guess.
Yeah.
So I was born without any hoopla. They didn't know anything was going on with me. And I was 2 weeks old when my parents had told me that I started crying, and they couldn't stop me from crying. They finally, with no hope of me stopping, they finally brought me to a doctor, and the doctor discovered I had a broken femur. That's the long bone in your thigh. Well, they thought it was just a crazy accident or something, or
Yeah.
would never happen again. I think today they would be a little bit more questioning of it, but back then, in my day, the doctor who my parents brought me to knew my family. They knew there was nothing nefarious going on, so they thought it was just something that wouldn't happen again. Well, 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time in the other femur. And that doctor then did some testing, and they discovered I had something called osteogenesis imperfecta, which is basically a collagen disorder, and it causes brittle bones. And from that point forward, as you stated, I've had a life where probably by the time I hit puberty, I already had 70 or 80 broken bones. And
And to the point, let me say for the audience,
yeah,
as crazy as this sounds, Gary spent so much time with doctors in hospitals, etc., that many times, Gary, you would actually self-diagnose.
oh
That
yeah,
when you were, I know stories of when an ambulance took you, and you would tell them,
yeah,
this is what's happened, this is what's broken.
yeah.
And many times they would actually kind of ignore you like you didn't know what you're talking about, and then later to be proven right.
Right. Well, when I was a kid, my doctors would always defer to me. I mean, I was 7, 8 years old, and I would go in and tell the doctor I had a hairline fracture of the tibia, I had a complete fracture of the femur, whatever, and I was always right. And the doctors at that point knew me really well, and they knew they could trust me. They obviously confirmed it with X-rays, but they knew they could trust me. When I hit adulthood, and I remember I had my probably my biggest fracture as an adult, which happened about 25 years ago. Um, that's when the first time I was ever in an ambulance, and the EMTs thought I was crazy when I diagnosed my own fractures.
Yeah. And, just setting the stage for the audience, because there is so much hope in your life, but setting the stage is to understand what a burden that is as a child. And I know this story, and I won't do it justice. So I want you to share it with the audience. That you shared this story with me a couple of years ago about how one time as a child going in for surgery, which is funny, we always as kids have these brilliant ideas, that you actually thought if you held your breath, the anesthesia would knock everybody else out, and you could actually make your escape. I mean, you'd spent so much time in the hospital by then, but share that story.
Well, by the time I was 10 years old, probably half of my life had been spent in the hospital. And you know how they say people have street smarts, they're street savvy. I think I had hospital smarts. So I was really comfortable in a hospital. You wouldn't want to say that, but I really kind of got, the lay of the land. So I was going into this one surgery, and for some reason it wasn't like the other ones, and I was apprehensive and I wanted to get out. So when I went into the operating room and the nurses were around me, the doctors were around me with their mask on, and they started having the mask that they were going to put over my face to give me ether at the time. And so I knew the doctors, and I said, "Hey, could I hold the mask?" And I'm a 7, 8-year-old kid, and I said, "Could I hold the mask?" So I held the mask about an inch away from my face, held my breath, and figured that the ether was going to come out the sides, and the whole room would become, they would all pass out, they would all be asleep, and then I could sneak out. That was my 7-year-old mind thinking. Not very different than my mind today.
Yeah. So, but now let's fast forward because you went through life with challenges most of us can't even imagine. But then from there, you have actually done some amazing things. You became a champion wheelchair athlete. And I want to say this because I don't think our audience is going to believe this. You were the successful owner of a health club, of a gym for 40 some odd years. And then on top of everything else, and not just driving, but what I find incredulous, Gary, is that you actually have a three-wheel motorcycle that, in spite of your challenges, that you actually ride a motorcycle.
Well, it's interesting. Growing up, breaking all those bones, one facet of a broken bone is extremely painful. Okay, I've heard doctors say to me that it's the most painful. Orthopedic pain is the most painful thing anyone will experience next to childbirth. So it was extremely painful. But the bigger thing is actually the emotional pain. As soon as you break a bone, all of a sudden your mind shifts to what you will not do now for the
Yeah,
next 3, 4, 5 months. So we're looking forward to a vacation. Boom, it's taken away. Looking forward to a trip. I remember to this day looking forward to going to the United Nations with my mom and dad. That was taken away from me. So there's this emotional pain. But thankfully, God has given me a supernatural ability to always look to the next thing and to try to keep hope alive. So
yeah,
I like to have fun, and I like to do somewhat daring. Like you mentioned, the three-wheel motorcycle. If I'm in control, like I'm not in control in certain situations. I wouldn't want you to drive at 130 miles an hour and me be in your car. But if I drove at 130 miles an hour in my car, that would be okay because
yeah,
I'm in control. So when I'm on my motorcycle, I'm in control. So as long as I could have a sense of, navigation and knowing what I'm doing when I'm in my wheelchair, the bone that I broke 25 years ago was one of the few times that I was not hyper vigilant when I was pushing my wheelchair. And I was at a venue that had a sidewalk. It was a brand new venue, but there was this one part of the sidewalk that was broken, and I didn't spot it because I was having fun with some friends. I didn't see it. My front wheels of my wheelchair hit it, and then I went flying out. So, but normally I try to stay very hyper vigilant, but it's a hard way to live, but it's survival for me. So I
yeah,
see things that a lot of people do not see. But at the same time, you're right. I do do crazy things if they're if they're in my control. If I
yeah.
think they're worth the risk.
If they're in your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But in a moment, Gary, we're going to talk about how you build this mindset of expecting and looking for God's best because you would have every excuse not to. Before we do, I want to also kind of share with the audience that you, even now, just like anybody else, you have those moments of, I'll call it despair. Maybe that's not the best word, but going back to you just talked about this incident where at the venue, hit the crack. I happen to know that you wound up in a cast. Now, you were a business owner, you had stuff going on, you wound up in a partial body cast, stuck in basically the basement of a hospital for several months. I mean, your entire life got put on hold. And I know from conversations we've had, that was kind of a dark moment. But in
Yes,
spite of those things, you have a genuine mindset of truly looking for and expecting God's best. But tell us about what that's like to have that kind of, how do you change from that kind of despair when you have this history of both physical and emotional pain? How can someone go through life with this amazing expectation of God's good?
I think the two biggest things for me, Randy, is who I listen to. Number one, listen to God and His truth and in His Word, and I have to believe it. That's hard, but I have to believe it. It might smell bad. It might look bad. It might feel bad. It might even taste bad. But I have to, because of God's word, I have to believe it's good.
You,
The
you
other
have
thing,
to choose, and let me interrupt because you and I have talked about this.
a conscious
It's
decision of your will.
It is.
Yeah,
And you and I have talked about 1 John 3:2 says, Beloved, I desire or pray, depending on the translation, that you would prosper and be in health as your soul prospers.
yeah,
And for so many people, that's this idea that as we have a certain degree of righteousness, but in reality, that word soul there literally means psyche.
yes,
As your thinking prospers,
yeah,
I desire you prosper and be in health. So it's such a matter of us taking that decisive control of our thoughts. And as you say, Gary, no matter the circumstances, how bad they look, rather than allowing our feelings to dictate, making that conscious decision to choose God's truth.
right.
But
Well, the other thing I would say is I try to choose it every day. I try to believe God every day. I try to expect good from God every day. But there's been seasons where I've expected bad. And that's when the other voices in your life, in your sphere, are so vital. Like I had a great mom and dad. They were wonderful parents. They would spend hours and hours and hours each day with me at the hospital. They were way better than many of the other kids in the ward and their parents. And I would be shocked that they would not have a visitor sometimes for weeks. But so I had great parents. But here's the big thing that I learned. My dad would say to me, "Be careful, Gary. It only takes a second." And he would kind of warn me out of love. Now my mom would say, "Do you really want to do that?" I said, "Yeah." She would say, "Go ahead and do it. If it breaks a bone, we'll do it another way next time."
yeah, we'll
I
learn a lesson.
Yeah, I credit both of them for being wonderful parents, but I credit my mom for giving me the ability and the motivation and the freedom to take chances. So, a business owner is a risk taker.
Yeah,
Actually, every day, Helen Keller said, life is a risk. There's no security in nature. It's one daring adventure. So
yeah.
everyone that's watching this, they take a risk every day, but it's up to them how far that risk will go.
Yeah. And it's funny, you and I talk about this, and we'll go into this a little bit further. And just as a setup, just so our audience knows, Gary and I, in another month or so, are going to actually do an episode just breaking down action
Yeah,
steps you can take to completely retrain your thinking.
right.
But along those lines, I want to throw this one out. So, Abraham, God made these amazing promises to Abraham, and he waited so long. Now, Romans 4:20 says it this way, and it makes it sound like he was like the superstar of the faith. It says he didn't waver in unbelief, but grew in faith, giving glory to God. So it makes it sound like it was easy. But it's interesting that that word did not waver. It's a Greek word, and what it means is to judge thoroughly. But it has the connotation that you're quivering inside when you do it. So a word picture is a few years, well, gosh, many years ago, I was at this conference in Oregon, and they said, "Hey, Randy, let's go river rafting." Now, in my mind, I'm picturing, white water, waves splashing everywhere, life preserver and helmet because you might die, right? And I got there, and it was really lazy river. It's little inner tubes you're floating down in, and you know me, Gary. I have an attention span of about 2 seconds. And so we're just kind of floating along, and they get to this point, and they say, "Hey, Randy, this is the jumping rock. Do you want to jump?" And I'm like, "Absolutely." So I run ahead of everybody, go up this trail, you come around, and you're on this ledge, and there's nobody in front of me, so I didn't stop. I just kind of kept going, went off, and as I'm in the air, my legs are kicking. I mean, picture Wile E. Coyote, right? Legs spinning in the air.
Yeah.
And I have a moment to realize, hey, it's a long way down. And then I hit the water, and I went down deep enough that you're looking up and you see the sun on the surface and thinking, wow, it's a long way back up. But I had fun. Now, here's where it's crazy, though. I went back, and I went to the top. But this time I stood at the edge and I looked. Now, at this point, everybody else has jumped. They're back in their inner tubes. And I had just successfully done it. But as I'm standing on the edge, everything inside of me was screaming, don't do it. That is that quivering inside. That's that voice, going back to what you were talking about, that voice inside of us that would say it's hopeless. That's that voice that would say, yes, that sounds amazing, but it can never happen for you. That's that voice that says whatever. Abraham still had those feelings, but he had to choose to judge God. And you can only judge God faithful. And in doing so, his faith grew and it gave glory to God. And in a way, Gary, that's kind of the epitome of your life, is that there are times, like when you're in that hospital basement, life on hold, how do I manage my business, so many things. And that's when you have to override it, and you would say this to everybody, overriding that voice inside, that voice in your head. And Gary, I would say, I know from experience, I'm sure you have too, other people who maybe sometimes are well-meaning, who would try to let you down gently. Well, don't get your hopes up. But it's choosing to judge God faithful. And I would say that's really kind of epitomizes your life.
Well, the voices, and we're going to kind of go over some of this in future episodes with you, but to be specific, the voices that you surround yourself with are critical.
Yeah.
We do such a great job of protecting our possessions, protecting our home, but we do a terrible job of protecting this,
Yeah.
protecting this. The voices we let in, the influences we let in, whether it's people talking to us, whether it's our closest friends, whether sometimes it's family, whether it's videos that we watch or movies that we watch or podcasts that we listen to, I think most people do a pretty poor job of guarding their mind and their heart,
Yeah.
and that's so critical. But there's always a mix. We always have to, because sometimes God will bring us through things not because He doubts we can do them, but because we doubt we can do them, and then He needs to help us prove to ourselves that yes, I can do that.
Yeah.
And that's vital. I remember being at a corporate retreat with a bunch of business owners up at Copper Mountain, Colorado. And I was there, I think we were there for 5 or 6 days. And one day they were going to go horseback riding. Now, what did I tell you before about if I'm in control, that's okay. If I'm not in control, that's not okay. Now, this was the one and only time that I've ever ridden a horse. And I was on that horse for 2 hours.
Wow.
And for an hour, we were going up 1,000 feet, climbing the mountain. And then for another hour, we were going down. My feet barely, my toes were just barely in the stirrups. And I was just holding that, what do you call it? The horn?
The rein. Oh yeah, the saddle horn. Yeah.
The saddle horn as tight as I could. And the guide was actually using the reins to guide me. So all I was doing was hang on to dear life. Now, what did that teach me? Now, that was a risk. That was a huge risk. Now, number one, God protected me because if I fell, I would have definitely broken bones, or because
Or
we're
worse.
side of a mountain, I could have died.
Yeah.
We were literally on the side of a mountain. But I proved to myself that I could step out and take a risk where I was really out of control and that God would provide and watch over me. Now, I'll never do it again,
Yeah.
but it did prove to me that, but
Yeah.
in scripture it talks about falling into the arms of God.
Yeah.
That's hard. That picture is great for me because I don't let anyone carry me. I don't let anyone, because then I'm completely out of control. But can I truly trust God with the rest of the day, with tomorrow, with
Yeah.
next week, next month? And that's so important to our lives. Can we really trust God? Now, obviously, we have to partner with Him in doing the right things. Like, I'm not going to go on a horse again, but I did at that time. And I've also discovered, Randy, the Holy Spirit is always talking to you,
Yeah.
but we often simply do not listen. We don't hear him. We're so
We're not
busy.
paying attention.
No, we're so busy with our own thoughts. We're so busy with our own intentions. I think we talked about this recently, but the average human has between 40 and 65,000 thoughts per day, and 80% of them are negative.
Yeah.
So it's like we're always preaching to ourselves. We're always talking to ourselves. What are those things saying?
And Gary, kind of in a weird segue, I mentioned earlier you owned a gym, a health club,
Yeah,
for successfully for over 40 years.
yeah,
And what a risk that had to be for a guy who's 4'2", navigates life in a wheelchair. That's such a massive risk at both a personal, business, and financial level. I mean,
right.
people, you got to overcome that fear of people looking at you going, what does this guy know about health and fitness? It's even beyond the normal business risk. But you were successful at that for many, many years.
I learned at a very young age, I discovered that when I enter a room, mostly everyone in the room defers to me because I'm different.
Yeah,
You said I'm a 4'2" guy in a wheelchair. I'm different. So they defer to me because they don't have close friends. Usually people don't know anyone that's in a wheelchair, especially somebody who's 4'2" in a wheelchair. So I learned that I could command attention.
yeah,
So I use that when people would come into my club, especially employees that would come in for interview or potential employees. Okay, I would use that in my interview to cut through all the fluff, to cut
yeah,
through all the facades, and to find out exactly who I was talking to. And um, and the, so the business came about basically because I was in wheelchair sports. I was rather good in wheelchair sports. I was nationally a top ranked wheelchair. At one point, I was number three in the world. Forgive me for bragging, but I was actually number three in the
sure.
world in the wheelchair mile. And I was also I was fast. I was not very tall, but I was fast in wheelchair basketball. So from that, I used to work at a rehabilitation hospital. I was an occupational therapy aide, and I would actually work with patients, which was a funny thing. When doctors would come in, they wouldn't know who the patient was and who the worker was. I was the worker. And
Yeah,
anyway, so I did that. And then it just seemed like a natural segue. I loved working with people. I loved impacting them physically and emotionally and their confidence and spiritually. And from that, I thought, you know what? It makes sense to go into the health field. And for me, it was the fitness field. So that's
yeah.
when I first opened a health club.
And through that, again, you were successful for many, many years, but you're at another stage of life now.
Yeah.
And and I do want to say this to our audience, and a congratulations that literally a week ago today, as of the recording,
Yes.
you just got married.
I
So
got
again,
married.
thanks
Yeah.
for taking time out of that honeymoon stage of the marriage to get together with us for the audience.
Only for you, Randy.
Hey, I appreciate that. But kind of moving forward, so we've gotten a glimpse of some of the successes, but also the mountains you've had to climb in life. But kind of moving forward, and again, we've kind of touched on it a few times, this expectation, this looking for God's good, looking for God's best, and retraining your mind. Now, you do a lot of inspirational speaking, you do coaching, you do mentoring, consulting, etc. And again, as I said earlier, we'll put it in the description below, Gary also has a website, unbreakablehope.com, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. But one of your big emphases is, and we will do a full episode on this in the near future, is retraining the mind. And we talked a bit about the voices, but it's going forward with that conscious decision to believe God's best. And along the way, we'll do more on this later, but you've actually developed action steps out of necessity to a certain degree on how you begin to retrain your mind, retrain your belief system. And I think it's such a necessity for people, for God's people, no matter your circumstances, that how often we don't see the amazing things that God wants to do because of our lack of faith. How often, Gary, people have this idea that God can, but they're not convinced He will.
He will, right.
And in the process, what we do is we unplug the power that's in that promise. That understanding that blessing is being connected into God's power to accelerate everything we do. But cursing, which sounds pretty harsh, but that's literally disconnecting from that power. So just like when God put Adam and Eve out of the garden, they had to work so much harder for all the benefits that God had provided so freely before. And in a way, it's the same way with our thought life. That the idea that we like God's benefits doesn't have really much power until we begin to absolutely believe and expect God's best, His benefits. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would. At one point in my life, I remember I gave a talk in a college, and during the question and answer portion at the end, one of the kids in the students there, he said to me, or he asked me, he said, "How did you not end up in a mental institution? Like
Wow.
how could you endure that?" And I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about looking back at my life. How did God bring me through that? What were the mechanisms? What were the strategies? Because when you read the scriptures, God can do everything ex nihilo, just out of
Yes.
nothing. But He uses people. But He
Right.
doesn't use them in a vacuum. He uses them strategically. They have strategies. They know what to do and what to do next. So I look back at my life and I said, what were the strategies that God has taught me, that I've taught, other people have taught me, or God has taught me through other people, that got me through those things? And that's what I employ now, because see, I firmly believe everyone that's listening to me, everyone that's in your audience right now, at one point or another, they've given up on a dream, on a ministry, on an aspiration, maybe a business, maybe a marriage, maybe a relationship, whatever it might be. And I'm 100%, well, I would say in 98% of the cases, people don't fail. They simply give up.
Yeah.
They simply quit. I just recently co-authored a book about a year ago with the famous Dick Vitale, who's the ESPN college basketball announcer. And he's in his 80s and he's raised over $100 million for pediatric cancer. And he's gone through all these things. And he wrote a book called Never Give Up. And I'm one of the authors with him because I've come up with these. So when I talk to people, it's about failure in life is really them making a conscious decision to give up.
Well, and I want to segue on that a little bit because the importance of lessons that Gary's learned. It's funny. I just yesterday have a ministry leader that I kind of mentor. And I was talking to him and I said, look, it's important as leaders that we build a platform for people to go further than us. Because it was out of the context of things that no one ever taught us.
Right.
And we had to learn. And it's important for us to put that into that next generation so that they don't have to relearn so many of the lessons, but they can
Absolutely.
take those and build on them. And that's really what you've done, Gary, is you have learned through all of these challenges, both the necessity and the process of retraining the brain. And what this does is provides the opportunity for people to be able to say, rather than go relearn it and spend years of pain and heartache, the accelerator, there's no shortcuts in the kingdom,
Right.
but there's accelerators.
Yes.
See, shortcuts are dead ends, but accelerators is when you take that wisdom from someone, like in this case from Gary, you take that wisdom, you incorporate it, you make it your own, and you build on it. And along those lines, I do want to make sure we touch on this. So, Gary is one of the most generous guys I know. My wife and I have stayed with him. He's got a beautiful place with an amazing view. He's a giver. And one of the things that he is giving is, again, if you go to his website, unbreakablehope.com, and go down to the, not the information form, what do you call it, Gary?
Right to the top to the right, you'll see a button that says sign up here, click here to get a 20-minute free one-on-one call with Gary. And that will be
So
through Zoom or audio, whatever
yeah.
you prefer.
So what Gary is offering is no charge, no obligation, 20-minute calls one-on-one to look at your personal situation and give you some action steps to be able to move forward in life. And this is a guy with so much experience. But then on top of that, now in many cases, those action steps really qualify people. They've gotten the tools now to be able to move forward. Now, in the instance where people do need more, they do have the ability to be able to say, hey, Gary, can I get another appointment? Can I, get some mentoring, some coaching, consulting, etc.? But the point really is, so often you do empower people in that one call to be able to take charge of their life.
I've had people tell me that 20 minutes changed years of their life. So yeah, there's no obligation. I love being able to impact people's mindsets, change people's mindsets, and point them or help them level up. Because so many of us will stay at the same level. And you know what? I don't care if I hit 113. God will continue. He's relentless at making us better, at making us nearer into the image of his son, at making us love him more, and actually more importantly, receive his love more. But
Right.
so many of us get content. We don't want to take the risk. We don't want to step out. We don't want to, the old A&P, you had to
Yeah.
step on the mat for the door to open.
Yeah.
We don't want to step on the mat. Or we step on the mat, the door opens, but we're too afraid to walk in.
And that's one of the things that I appreciate about you, Gary, because you and I have common hearts. Now, for me, my thing is to challenge those, but those that are comfortable and want to be comfortable, that's like, okay, have a nice day. I'm not the one for you.
Right.
I'm for those who want more.
Amen.
And you have this heart to really challenge those that even are comfortable. That's not my voice, and that's about authenticity. But yours is authentic, where you're challenging both those who are saying, yeah, help, I need more insight, I need some action steps. But you also are there to challenge those who are willing to say, yeah, I'm comfortable, but maybe. And God has positioned you uniquely to be able to do that and to be able to challenge people's thinking and to open their eyes in a way that many of the rest of us just can't do.
Well, you know what? We all have platforms. We all have spheres of influence. And I've discovered that being in a wheelchair is this amazing stage.
Yeah.
People look down upon it in many instances, but they'll also listen to me, whereas they might not listen to someone else.
Right.
So being in a chair gives me an ability to influence people in a unique way, and in a powerful way, believe it or not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is literally the calling card of your authenticity, that what you're saying is genuine. It's, you and I have never talked about it, but I think you'd agree how often there's voices out there. I'm thinking, I won't mention names, but I'm thinking of this one guy. And he would say stuff, and while on one hand you knew it was true, you also had the sense, did he read that in a book? That it was like it was the right thing to say, but it didn't seem like it came from this authentic ownership that literally he had experienced it. He was leading in that. It was literally when somebody's going through this is what you say. And you and I both have seen so often in the world, especially in the world today, how many voices that really aren't authentic. They may say good stuff, it may be intriguing, but they've never lived it out. And one thing is, you've got the calling card that literally, when you wheel up in your chair, everything you say comes from experience. And so I do encourage all of our followers, viewers, subscribers, take Gary up on it. Like I said, go to the website, unbreakablehope.com, click the link, fill it out, get 20 minutes with Gary. It will absolutely be worth your time. There's no sales pitch, there's no gimmicks, but it will be worth your time. It'll begin to transform your thinking. And on top of that, if you do desire, if it would be helpful, Gary's available to begin to walk with you even beyond that, if that's something that's needed for your life. And so, Gary, I thank you for that. I thank you for that generous heart. And I look forward to the next time we're back down your way and staying with you with that amazing view.
Absolutely. I can't wait.
Absolutely. And so, Gary, thanks for being with us. And again, unbreakablehope.com. We'll have it down in the description. And on top of that, be watching. In about a month or so, Gary and I will do a follow-up, and we will specifically record some action steps, some concrete steps you can take to begin to retrain your thinking, retrain your belief system to expect God's best. Gary, any final words?
You know what? I would tell people that are watching us, it's a good thing to test the limits. It's
Yeah,
a good thing to go out of your comfort zone. You know, we all have our comfort zones. And I would say, even if it's just a little bit, try to push outside that comfort zone, because throughout Scripture, throughout history, the great men of the Bible, the great men of history, they have stepped out of their comfort zone, and they end up doing things that we look back at and think, wow, that changed the course of history. And you know what? I believe that I'm changing the course of history. And I believe, Randy, that you are, and that the people that are watching, they have the ability to change lives and to really rock the world. So I would say go for it.
absolutely. Hey, Gary, thanks for being with us. And again, I've said it, but I have to say it again. You know, Gary's absolutely right. And that's one of my things that just makes me crazy is how often, think about it, God is your safety net. And we have this weird thing, and I say this all the time, and people look at me funny. You've heard me say it before, Gary. Nobody did it perfect but Jesus.
Yeah.
We've got this weird expectation that God's sitting there with his arms folded like,
Yeah.
are they going to do it just right? Rather than God saying, I picture God like, I don't know if you've ever seen this, Gary, but you know, you're at a resort in the swimming pool, and there's a little kid standing on the side of the pool, and Dad's going with his arms out, jump to me,
Yeah.
jump to me. Dad wants you to experience this.
Yes.
And it's a test of trust. And when we step out of our comfort zone, even when we don't do it perfectly,
Yeah.
God is there. Which reminds me, and I'm going to close with this, but a great story, which was one of my favorites. Jesus sends the disciples ahead. They're in the boat, wind and the waves. They're afraid, right? They're terrified. They think they're going to die. Now, you know it's a storm when professional fishermen are afraid.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But then Jesus comes walking on the water. Now, he's not in the boat yet, but see, this is most people. They see Jesus coming, and it's like, okay, Jesus is going to be here. It's going to just be okay. And they were happy to just stay in the boat and be okay. But Peter did something different.
Right.
Now, most people look at this story and they see it a failure, and I don't. I see something totally different. See, Peter was impetuous, but he didn't get out of the boat without authority.
Mm-hmm.
He's, call me to you. Jesus called him out. He had complete permission and authority to do it.
Amen.
And he got out, He starts. For a moment, he's walking on water. How amazing is that? And then the wind and the waves, the circumstances distract him, which kind of goes along with your thing about your thinking. And he starts to sink, which is kind of funny. You think you're either walking on the water or you're not. But how does Jesus respond? And this is the coolest part of this story. When he sinks, Jesus immediately rescues him, and he doesn't rebuke him. What he says is, where was your faith? In other words, what we see is Jesus wanted him to succeed.
That's right.
He didn't say, don't ever try that again.
Yeah.
He's exhorting him
Yes.
to greater faith.
Yes.
And Gary, that's one of the things that you do with people. I love you. You're a great friend. Thanks for being on with us today. And I look forward to doing a follow-up and like I said, working on those specific action steps to retrain your thinking.
Thank you.
Thank
Randy.
you again.